Since the dawn of civilization, when humans still walked barefoot through landscapes dominated by dense forests, silent mountains, and sacred rivers, they already carried within their chest a restlessness that could not be satisfied with food or shelter alone. It was the question that echoed in the void of starless nights, the whisper of the wind in deep caves, the hypnotic glow of fire crackling in the first tribal bonfires. Why are we here? This search for meaning was perhaps the first step in the creation of religious beliefs. And thus, religion was born not as a complex system, but as an instinctive gesture of reverence toward the unknown. When thunder roared in the skies, it was a god's cry. When the harvest was abundant, it was a blessing. When drought ravaged the land, it was a punishment. The first religions were animistic. They attributed spirit to everything that lived and even to what seemed dead. Stones, trees, mountains, rivers, the sun itself. Every element of the world had a soul, a will, a mysterious force that needed to be respected, nourished, feared. And more than that, every natural phenomenon was a message. The storm was not just water, it was a response. Birth was not just biological, it was sacred. Death was not the end, it was the beginning of another journey, perhaps in the same world, perhaps in another plane. Shamans, the first priests, emerged as bridges between the visible and the invisible. They were the ones who listened to the gods, spoke with the ancestors, healed with herbs and visions, interpreted the silence from beyond. There were no stone temples. The temple was the forest itself, the mountain top, the womb of the cave. And in this atmosphere of mystery and reverence, the first religions began to shape not only rituals, but the entire organization of human societies. As the centuries passed and human communities grew, beliefs evolved as well. Tribes became cities. Cities became kingdoms. And the gods, in turn, gained names, forms, hierarchies. Thus emerged the pantheon. In Mesopotamian civilizations such as Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, each city had its patron deity. Enlil, the god of winds. Inanna, goddess of love and war. Marduk, conqueror of the old gods. Temples were no longer clearings and caves. Now they were ziggurats, monumental towers of stone raised to the sky like divine staircases. Religion began to take on structure. Priests, scribes, offerings, sacred laws. The spiritual world started to become institutionalized. And it didn't take long for religion to also become a tool of power. The Egyptian pharaoh, for example, was not just a king. He was considered a living god, the incarnation of Horus. The temple was the center of the empire, both spiritually and economically. Sacrifices, festivals, rituals of death and rebirth became routines that not only pleased the gods but maintained social order. Similarly, in ancient India, the Vedas, sacred texts of the Aryans, laid the foundation of Hinduism. Deep concepts such as karma, dharma, and samsara emerged. The idea that the soul goes through many lives, carrying its actions and sufferings, completely changed the vision of existence. Religion ceased to be just a means to please the gods and became also a path to liberation, a map of the human soul. And amid all of this, spirituality intertwined with astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and art. It was impossible to separate the sacred from daily life. Religion was in everything. In ancient Greece, religion took on new colors. The gods now had human forms. They were beautiful, but also jealous, vengeful, passionate. Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Athena, Aphrodite. The Olympian gods lived in a pantheon that reflected the virtues and vices of humanity itself. Greek religion, although polytheistic, began to flirt with philosophy. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle questioned the myths and searched for a more universal truth. Reason began to converse with faith. And this tension would deepen in the Roman Empire, where the Greek gods were absorbed and renamed. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus. Rome, with its expansionist power, also absorbed the gods of conquered peoples, creating a kind of religious supermarket. But it was precisely in this setting of multiplicity that a new and revolutionary idea began to spread: monotheism, a single, invisible, eternal God, creator of all things. This idea, born among the Hebrews, seemed absurd to the Romans. How could someone believe in a God who had no image, no temple, who could not be seen? And yet, Judaism endured. And in time, it gave rise to one of the greatest spiritual revolutions in history: Christianity. Based on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, Christianity not only challenged the old gods, but also the social, political, and moral order of the time. It declared that the last would be first, that the poor were blessed, that love was greater than law. At first, Christians were persecuted, killed, devoured by lions. But centuries later, this faith born on the margins of the empire would become the official religion of Rome. The crucified Christ was now enthroned as Lord of the world. A new era was beginning. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Middle Ages, the Christian religion would become the foundation of the Western world. The Catholic Church, based in Rome, assumed not only spiritual authority but also temporal power. The Pope was more influential than kings. The Bible, written in Latin, was inaccessible to common people, and salvation was mediated by priests, saints, and sacraments. Monasteries preserved knowledge but also imposed a strict moral and dogmatic code. It was a time of blind faith, but also of deep devotion. The cathedrals erected during this period, such as Notre Dame or the Basilica of St. Peter, were not just buildings, they were prayers sculpted in stone. Meanwhile, in the East, Islam was born. In 610 AD, the Prophet Muhammad received the revelation of the Quran. Within a few decades, Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula to Africa, Asia, and Europe. Allah is the only God. Muhammad is his messenger. Prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage to Mecca became pillars of the Muslim faith. The world was now dominated by three major monotheisms: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all children of Abraham, all with sacred scriptures, all with promises of salvation and final judgment. At the same time, in the East, Buddhism was expanding with its proposal of enlightenment without the need for a creator god. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, taught that suffering is born from desire, and that it is possible to attain nirvana, liberation, through compassion, wisdom, and meditation. Each religion offered a path, but all answered the same question: what is the human being in the face of the eternal? In the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, religious beliefs would face their greatest challenges. With the Renaissance, man turned his gaze back upon himself, his reason, his body, his art. Science began to gain ground. Galileo looked to the heavens with telescopes. Copernicus removed Earth from the center of the universe. Darwin proposed that we came from apes. Freud said that God was a projection of the unconscious. Faith, once unquestioned, was now subjected to analysis, criticism, doubt. New religious branches emerged. The Protestant Reformation, led by Martin Luther, broke the hegemony of the Catholic Church. The Bible was translated, printed, and read by the people. Dogmas were questioned. Reformed churches, Baptists, Lutherans, and Calvinists emerged. At the same time, mystical movements such as Spiritism, Theosophy, and esoteric traditions sought new forms of religiosity. Religion became decentralized. There was no longer a single temple, but many. No longer a single truth, but many interpretations. And with the age of exploration, Contact with indigenous, African, and Asian cultures brought forth a plurality of beliefs the Western world had never imagined. Shamanisms, candomblé, Hinduism, Taoism, native religions, all showed that spirituality could not be contained in a single book, that the divine could be multiple, circular, paradoxical. And perhaps the greatest revolution was this, realizing that there is not one single path to the sacred, but many. That faith, like humanity, is diverse, alive, and in constant transformation. Now in the 21st century, we live in an era marked by two opposing forces: secularization and spiritualization. On one side, we see the rise of atheism, agnosticism, and skepticism. Many abandon traditional religions, disillusioned by scandals, hypocrisy, and hate speech disguised as holiness. Science dominates the collective imagination. Google answers what was once attributed to the gods. Medicine promises to prolong life. Technology offers digital immortality. And yet, spirituality has never been so sought after. Meditation, yoga, astrology, energy healing, synchronicity, spiritual quantum physics, expansion of consciousness. The sacred has left the temples and entered the apps. Churches fill on Sundays, but so do silent retreats deep in the forest. God is no longer only in heaven. He is in the breath, in the present, in the body, in the other. Organized religions now compete with personal experiences, everyday spiritualities, Instagram sages, and TikTok gurus. And the curious thing is that even amidst so much information, the question remains the same as the one our ancestors asked while dancing around the fire. Why are we here? And perhaps, no matter how far science advances, no matter how much technology evolves, this question will never be fully answered. Because religion, in the end, is not about absolute truths. It is about mystery, about the silence that pulses in the human heart, about that which no formula can calculate, that which moves us, transforms us, connects us. Religion does evolve, yes, but the thirst that drives it, that remains the same. Imagine a world where the divine no longer dwells in marble temples, golden altars, or Gothic cathedrals that reach toward the heavens. Imagine a faith that does not speak only through Sunday sermons, but through the silence of a deep dive into oneself. A spirituality that does not wear the robes of dogma, but of presence. A connection with the invisible that requires no intermediaries, only awareness. It is in this increasingly common scenario that the future of faith is being drawn. A time when human beings, tired of ready-made answers, return to asking questions. Where the sacred is no longer the property of institutions, but an intimate and untransferable experience. Welcome to the spiritual 21st century. A century where religiosity does not die, it reinvents itself. And more than that, it expands into horizons that our ancestors could never have imagined. What once was faith based on fear is now becoming faith based on direct experience. What once was blind obedience is now becoming conscious inquiry. Spirituality is ceasing to be an inheritance and becoming a choice. This transition is not subtle. It is seismic. The statistics already show millions of people around the world are leaving institutional religions. In the United States, for example, more than 30% of the population already identifies as non-religious. In Brazil, the number of people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious grows with every census. But that doesn't mean that faith is disappearing. On the contrary, it is changing shape. Traditional prayer gives way to silent meditation. Worship services give way to conscious breathing. The search is no longer for a heaven after death. It is for presence in the now. The new spiritual seeker doesn't just want to know who God is. They want to know who they are. And in this process, They begin to question the old promises of future salvation, realizing that perhaps paradise is not a distant place, but a state of consciousness accessible here and now. That is why practices like mindfulness, ayahuasca retreats, self-discovery journeys, holistic therapy, and ancient traditions such as Buddhism, Taoism, and shamanism have gained so much ground in the West. People are rediscovering that faith doesn't need a stage, only a heart that is open. At the heart of this transformation lies the return to the body. For centuries, religions tried to separate body from soul. They created a dichotomy between the material and the spiritual, as if the sacred existed only in the invisible. But the future of faith seems to be moving in the opposite direction. It unites. It integrates. It understands that the body is a temple, not metaphorically, but literally. It is a temple because it is where consciousness resides. It is a temple because it is through the body that we feel, breathe, connect. It is a temple because, when closed off from the senses, no spirituality is possible. That's why today we see an explosion of practices that place the body at the center of spiritual experience. Ecstatic dances, yoga, silent walks, forest bathing, conscious eating, tantric sexuality, energy healing. A whole new language that points toward a kind of faith lived in the blood, the skin, the bones. An embodied faith, no longer based on future promises, but on present states. And this frightens traditional religions, because this type of spirituality cannot be controlled. It cannot be organized. It cannot be indoctrinated. It is free, organic, ever-changing. And it is precisely because of this that, as free spirituality grows, so does fundamentalism. Yes, the future of faith is ambiguous. On one side, there is the flowering of consciousness. On the other, the hardening of dogmas. Radical religious groups gain ground, promising order in the midst of chaos. They create closed communities, fed by fear, hatred, and exclusion. They use sacred texts to justify prejudice. They confuse faith with fanaticism. But behind this radicalism lies an uncomfortable truth. It is a symptom of the fear of change. The more faith evolves, the more ancient pillars tremble. And many prefer to cling to old certainties rather than open themselves to mystery. The challenge of the future is this: how to preserve the depth of faith without falling into rigidity. How to embrace the new without losing the sacred. How to evolve spiritually without abandoning the heart of what is divine. The answer, perhaps, lies in listening. Listening to the pain of others. Listening to the wisdom of ancient peoples. Listening to one's own intuition. And above all, listening to the silence, the kind that does not judge, does not impose, does not divide. It simply welcomes. And something even more transformative is happening. Spirituality is becoming ecological. Yes, the future of faith is returning to the earth. Literally. After centuries in which religion looked only to the heavens, it is now beginning to understand that salvation is not outside the planet. It lies in saving it. The environmental collapse has awakened in many spiritual traditions the urgency of reconnecting with nature. Pope Francis speaks of integral ecology. Indigenous peoples speak of Mother Earth as a living being. Buddhists speak of interdependence. Young spiritualists refuse to consume unconsciously. They plant, recycle, reduce, fast. Because they've understood that spirituality without environmental responsibility is disguised selfishness. The earth is no longer just the stage. It has become the protagonist of spiritual awakening. The forests, the rivers, the oceans, the winds, all of these are becoming sacred again. Not as symbols, but as living entities. And that changes everything. Because the faith that protects the earth is the same that heals the soul. The faith of the future is green. It is sensitive. It is interconnected. And if you think that technology will distance humanity from faith, you may need to look again. The future of spirituality will also be digital. We are entering an age where artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and neural interfaces will become part of the spiritual experience. There are already apps that guide meditation, detect emotional patterns, simulate transcendental experiences. Virtual churches are emerging. Avatars lead spiritual retreats in the metaverse. It may sound absurd now, but centuries ago, it was also absurd to imagine that a book could speak to millions at once. Technology, in itself, is not the enemy of faith. It can be a tool, an amplifier, a channel. The danger lies not in the technology, but in the lack of awareness in how it is used. A robot will never replace the sacred, but it may help someone find it, if well programmed. The big question will be, who is programming the faith of the future? Will it be used to awaken, or to control, to connect, or to sell? The spirituality of tomorrow will have to learn how to navigate the digital world with discernment, to use technology as a trampoline, not a crutch, as a mirror, not a mask. Finally, perhaps the greatest transformation of future spirituality is this. It will be collective, yet deeply personal. There will be no more room for impositions. Each human being will have to discover their own path. There will be as many spiritualities as there are people. And at the same time, all these experiences will form an invisible web of universal connection. A web where each point is unique, but all are connected. Faith will cease to be vertical, with a guard at the top and followers at the bottom, and become horizontal, fluid, rhizomatic. All teachers, all learners, all channels, all divine. This is not a utopia, it's a trend. We already see this in new spiritual communities, in healing circles, in meditation groups, in connections made in silence. The future of faith will be inclusive, and not just in speech, but in practice. It will include the feminine, the masculine, the non-binary, the fat body, the old body, the disabled body. It will include the sensitive atheist, the skeptical believer, the lost seeker. It will include error, chaos, and emptiness. Because all of that is part of the journey. Because all of that, in some way, is sacred. The spirituality of the future will not be perfect, but it will be true. It won't be uniform, but it will be authentic. It won't be pure, but it will be whole. And perhaps that will be the greatest sign of spiritual evolution, to stop chasing idealized light and embrace one's own shadow with compassion, not to try to save the world with absolute truths, but to heal it with loving presence, not to prove that God exists, but to allow Him to bloom in every gesture, every word, every glance. The future of faith is being born now, inside you, in the moment when, amid the noise, you choose to listen to what truly matters, in the moment when you fall silent and realize the sacred was never outside, it was always you.